I don't see it on the channel yet.
Hey, Matt. I just got a text from Max Felker-Cantor that he can see us all on the channel. So,
thank you, Simon. Matt, do you want to get started?
Yeah, we're live. We can get started.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for those of you who have joined us already on YouTube, and for all of our participants who are here. I think people are going to continue to trickle in, so we might as well get started. Welcome everyone to the Metropole's first of what we hope will be a few roundtable conversations on racist police violence, the spring 2020 uprisings, and police abolition. For those of you who don't know, the Metropole is the official blog of the Urban History Association, an organization founded in 1988 to stimulate interest and forward research and study of the history of the city. We hope you'll consider joining the Urban History Association as a member, and for more information, you can go and sign up at urbanhistory.org/membership.
So before we get started, we wanted to give two quick announcements. First, we wanted to let you know that our next panel, entitled Urban Uprisings Against Racist Police Terror and Historical Context, will be next Tuesday, July 7th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and will feature Dr. Austin McCoy, Dr. Carl Sudler, Dr. Max Felker-Cantor, and Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Heather Ann Thompson. So mark your calendars and look out for more information about that coming shortly. Second, we wanted to let viewers know a little bit about the format for this evening's event. So after some introductory remarks, we've asked our panelists to speak for 5 minutes each about how their research sheds light on the current moment. Then Matt and I will ask some questions just to keep the discussion going. And then finally, we'll take some questions from viewers. And there are two ways that you can submit questions to the panel. First, you can submit questions via email. The address is themetropole@urbanhistory.org. Again, that's themetropole@urbanhistory.org. Second, the Metropole editor Ryan Reft will be on the Urban Historical Association's Twitter @urbanhistorya. Where you can send questions via Twitter DM or just at the account, whatever works. So please, as you watch, submit your questions for panelists and help us keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Charlotte. So first, we want to take a moment to thank the speakers for participating in this event. It's a really wild time, and it's, depending on where people are, it's fairly late in the day. So thank you very much for coming and taking time away from your valuable writing and teaching that enriches the field that we're kind of all building together right now. I also want to thank everybody who's tuning in on YouTube, and Charlotte and the folks at Metropole and I envisioned initially this event as kind of part academic conversation as to how we, scholars and educators about racial state violence, should understand the current moment, and also kind of part teach-in for how people can understand kind of these social movements and the organizing that are happening right now. You can tell right now from the context of the bestseller list, the nonfiction bestseller list, that people are really kind of craving good content on how to explain our current kind of moment in terms of racial state violence. And we really wanted to open up this space for scholars who are doing the cutting edge work on this to discuss the context of how we got to this moment where there are uprisings and protests in 2,000 cities across the United States and on multiple continents. And also how statues and the names of buildings are finally coming down after, in some cases, over 100 years of protests from Black and Indigenous communities.
So of course, for many, including many watching this event, what is happening in the streets, in city halls, in fraternal order of police lodges is not a surprise at all. Let us not forget that there has never been a moment of US history when Black people, Indigenous people, immigrants, trans, queer, and other gender nonconforming people and people of color have not listed among their chief concerns in society the violent arm of the state that has been able to brutalize and exploit with impunity. There is an unbroken line of police violence, Angela Davis said, that takes us all the way back to the days of slavery. And there are a few who can testify to this fact better than the historians of US policing who we have here today.
But before we go any further and bring in the panelists to talk about their research, we just wanted to take a moment to pause and remember George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Elijah McClain, Rashard Brooks, David McAtee, Robert Forbes, Ahmaud Arbery, Layleen Polanco, and the countless others who have been killed and suffered due not just to racial state violence, but also state-sanctioned violence. So we're just going to pause for a minute. All right, thank you. So now each panelist is going to be asked for 5 minutes to discuss how their specific research, many of them have books that have just come out or are forthcoming, and we'd like to hear how their specific work and the geographic context that they study kind of help us to understand what's happening in our current moment.
Awesome, thanks, Matt. So I'm gonna kick us off by introducing Dr. Simon Balto, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Iowa. Dr. Balto's recent book, Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago from Red Summer to Black Power, which was published under the Justice, Power, and Politics series at the University of North Carolina Press, explores the development of a police system in Chicago's Black neighborhoods that over the course of the mid-20th century became simultaneously brutally repressive and neglectful. His writing has appeared in Time Magazine, The Washington Post, The Progressive, the Journal of African American History, Labor, and numerous other popular and scholarly outlets, including just today, being interviewed by Jeremy Scahill for Intercepted podcast, which I encourage everyone to give a listen to. Thanks so much. Take it away, Simon.
Thanks so much to you, Charlotte, to Matt, to everyone at UHA, everyone at the Metropole for putting this together, to my fellow panelists. I get to see Dr. Howard with regularity because she and I text too much, but it's good to see my fellow colleagues. So yeah. What I just want to open with by saying is that I think that, you know, for those of us who study the history of policing, I think that the history of policing is essentially an abolitionist argument. You know, that, and I mean that in multiple senses. So I mean that in the first place by, in the sense that when people struggle with the idea of a world without police or cities without police, and say that it's unimaginable that we can exist in such places, we have in the past, right? I mean, that it's not that police forces were baked into the very cake of US cities from their very founding, right? That they have an origin story, just like we as historians are trained to understand origin stories. And so, and this is, I mean, to the point that Charlotte made about things I was talking about on the Intercepted podcast, I mean, just to reiterate some things that I said there, you know, when we look at the lineage of urban police departments in the US, you know, it's all local contexts, but it's all a history of implementation of police departments for particular political ends, and those political ends largely revolved around economic and racial hierarchies. So, you know, one of the ways that we can track this, and going back to the quote from Angela Davis that Charlotte raised, you know, in some ways we can trace this back to slave patrols. So, you know, looking at the studies of how slave patrols bled into and overlapped with Southern police forces, as Adam Malka has argued in his book on Baltimore, showing how, you know, the Baltimore Police Department really emerged out of the desire of white vigilantes to control free Black bodies and free Black people during and after the Age of Emancipation. And so, you know, that's a particular context that I think is worth understanding, that like the police forces in those spaces emerge because of a desire to protect racial hierarchies, but also to protect capital, right? I mean, slave patrols are protecting capital. Also in like a different context. So in a context like Chicago, I'll retreat to my home turf to, you know, the one that I know the best. You know, in a city like Chicago that doesn't have a huge Black population when the police force is put in place, they're not the problem population. The problem population in Chicago for the people who demand and fund the early police department are business elites and nativists. So people in Chicago, when the police department in Chicago was founded in 1853, the primary goal of the people who found it are people who want to control the undesirable behaviors of German and Irish immigrants, things like drinking, and so on and so forth, and they want to control labor militants. So in other words, what's going on in Chicago is an express effort to reinforce ethnic hierarchies in that case. And again, remember that, you know, Germans and Irish were not really considered to be like quote unquote white at this point in time. And so it's in a lot of ways sort of a variation on the theme of racial control. And then it's about protecting economic interests. So trying to, you know, literally break the strikes of people who are involved in the emerging labor movement. So I think that when we understand those pieces of the puzzle together, it actually is fairly easy to understand how history presents itself with an abolitionist argument, because if we think about the fact that A, police have not always existed, and B, that when they were brought into existence, it was primarily not to protect some sort of generic public order, but rather to protect particular pieces of property and to protect particular social norms and social hierarchies. And then fast forward to the year 2020, where we can see that what police primarily do is protect capital and protect property and uphold and preserve racial hierarchies. I mean, it's actually a fairly clear line. And I mean, I know that we're discouraged as professional historians from, you know, drawing through lines from, you know, the Chicago Police Department's founding in 1853 and what it does in 2020. But, you know, the central logics that undergirded the implementation of the police department in Chicago in the first place continue to sort of make sense now, right? I mean, that what the police department does in 2020 makes sense. It's just that what has changed is who they do it to and the ways in which they do it. And so the last point that I want to make in that sense is that, you know, when Black Chicagoans really become a target population of the Chicago Police Department, it's when Black Chicagoans begin to become a statistically significant population in the city, right? And so that's when city boosters, so the same people guided by the same logics who wanted to control undesirable people in the past, sort of their ancestors want to control these undesirable people in their own day. And so, you know, when I begin my book in the 19-teens, the reason I do that is not just because the 1919 riots in Chicago are such an important touchstone, but also because it's in that moment that both Black Chicago is cohering as a space, as a sort of geographically defined space in the city, and also at a moment in which the police department's attentions are beginning to turn towards controlling the people who live in that space. And so I think it's really important to understand the ways in which kind of the central logics of what police do hold over time in some degrees. It's just who they are doing it to changes based upon the particular racisms and racial hierarchies that animate and undergird that local context at that particular time.
Great, thanks so much for that, Simon. That was awesome. All right, so next we're gonna go to Dr. Gray Fischer, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Texas in Dallas. Dr. Fischer is currently working on a book entitled Arrestable Behavior, Women, Police Power, and the Making of Law and Order America, which is under contract also with Justice, Power, and Politics series at the University of North Carolina Press, which examines the sexual policing of women as the racial and sexual politics of US cities underwent dramatic transformations across the 20th century. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the Journal of American History, and the Journal of Social History. All right, take it away, Anne.
All right, thank you so much, Matt and Charlotte and the UHA and the Metropole for doing this really valuable, continuing to do such valuable work for the profession and for broader audiences. I'm so glad to share a Zoom screen with my fellow panelists. I wish we were all in person, but I'll take this. This works too. So I'd really, and double thanks to Simon for setting up where I'll go next so brilliantly. That was perfect ground to perfect shoulders to be building on. I do want to start by naming the fact that my opening remarks will contain discussions of sexual violence. So I honor the courage and the vision of the uprisings that have surged in George Floyd's name, but I'm here today to talk about that in order to fully reckon with state violence, we have to reckon with the distinct ways that police target Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other cis, trans, and gender non-conforming people, as well as cis women of color. So scholar activists, including Kimberly Crenshaw, Andrea Ritchie, and Miriam Kaba, have exposed the vulnerability in particular of Black, cis, and trans women like Breonna Taylor and Layleen Polanco, to police brutality, murder, sexual assault, and violent neglect. As these scholars argue, the failure to recognize that women of color are victims of unique forms of police violence, right? And the failure to recognize the specific ways in which women experience police violence has material consequences for our policy demands. So tonight I'm going to talk about gender-specific violence, including rape and the extortion of sex in exchange for non-arrest, how sexual violence has and continues to be a built-in feature of everyday police work. And I'll close by raising the question, what the practice of police sexual violence means for our abolitionist demands. So the bulk of police work is so-called public order enforcement. This is really drawing from what Simon had so wonderfully spoke about previously. Public order enforcement is now euphemistically referred to as public safety work. And urban policing, particularly in the modern period, the 20th century, has historically meant enforcing a white supremacist, patriarchal, and capitalist vision of social order. Women on city streets, especially poor white women and women of color, have historically been seen as a major danger to this urban order. Because of their role as both literal and social reproducers of the next generation, women's presumed behaviors and sexual practices were seen as major threats to unleash social chaos, right? And that social chaos in this particular white vision was racial integration, urban crime and criminality, and economic decline. So we now live in a broken windows regime that prizes this white capitalist vision of social order with a vengeance. Lethal militarized officers enforce public order through aggressive, low-level misdemeanor policing. If there's time later, I could say more about how this connects to gentrification and the crucial role that sexual policing played in building this current police regime. But for now, I'll just note, right, that the police mandate to impose this social order authorizes an outrageous and notoriously reform-resistant discretionary police power, right, a power which is racist, sexist, and transphobic by design. Policing strategies to promote public safety are structured as an inevitable and unaccountable breeding ground of state-sponsored sexual coercion, extortion, and force. Under the vast cover of public order enforcement, rape is justified as a legitimate, legal, and necessary form of police work. This is especially clear in the practice of prostitution-related misdemeanors, policing for those misdemeanors. Undercover entrapment, for example, encourages police to engage in sexual acts with women in order to gain evidence, right? And this is a practice that for targeted women is experienced as sexual assault. It wasn't until 2017 that Michigan banned officers from engaging in penetrative sex with sexually profiled women, right? And sexual contact remains legal in all 50 states. But legal niceties like Michigan's ban cannot shield poor and marginalized women from the extreme disparities of power between targeted women and police. And it cannot shield them from the police who are free to exploit this extreme disparity of power. Women do not have to be sexually profiled in order to be vulnerable to police sexual violence. In fact, the criminalization of women for low-level misdemeanors, such as drug offenses, renders them vulnerable to police assault because officers know that women with prior records have the least access to legal standing, political power, or material resources. Right, so women's experiences of state violence then expose the lie that police provide safety and protective services. Right? On the contrary, police create violence and danger. Police violence, I also just want to name, is not only about what police do, but also about the harms generated by their neglect. So again, if there's time later, I'd like to say more about the ways that police violence directly connects to the epidemic of non-state violence against trans women of color, like Remy Falls, Raya Milton, and most recently in my city, Dallas, Mercy Mack. So to close, when we center women's experiences with police, we see that arguments about the unreformability of police have been building for nearly a century. In the 1970s and 1980s, Black sex worker activists like Wilmette Brown and Gloria Lockett and their feminist and queer and anti-capitalist allies were at the forefront of calls for abolition. They argued that police power has been built on women's bodies, and that the only way to meaningfully dismantle police power is to deny officers their discretionary authority over women's bodies. This is an essential next step in the unmaking of police power. In order to realize our fullest and most transformative abolitionist visions, we must reckon with the central reality of gender-specific police violence. When we imagine what carceral divestment and community investment looks like, we must prioritize work that sustains Black, cis, and trans women's bodily autonomy, care, and safety.
Thank you so much for that, Anne. That was, and I'm really excited to discuss more a lot of what you raised, especially as we think about how, as Simon said, the history of police is in many ways an abolitionist argument. I think you're raising some really important elements about how we need to be talking about sexual violence, and also acknowledging that calls for abolition come out of a politics led primarily by Black women fighting against state-sanctioned sexual violence and interpersonal sexual violence as well. So thank you so much for raising that. Okay, next we're gonna go to Dr. Toussaint Losier, who is assistant professor in the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is co-author of the excellent book, I recommend everyone to get this book, Rethinking the American Prison Movement with Dan Berger, and is currently preparing a book manuscript titled War for the City, Black Chicago and the Rise of the Carceral State, which focuses on the grassroots response to the post-war emergence of mass incarceration in Chicago. His writing has been published in Souls, Radical History Review, the Journal of Urban History Against the Current, and Left Turn magazine. Great, go for it, Toussaint.
Thank you. And just for the record, if anybody's asking, I did not pay Charlotte to give the ringing endorsement of my book and Dan's book. There was no quid pro quo. I know we're talking a lot about Chicago here, and I know folks have kind of that sort of assumption about our much beloved city, but that was thoroughly genuine and very much appreciated. Yeah, just wanted to start off echoing the previous panelists in terms of thanking Charlotte and Matt in terms of both the introduction and all the work that they've done to make this possible. And really want to thank the Metropole blog and really just the effort to kind of foster this kind of intervention around kind of the questions of the day. And to the degree to which we as scholars can not just think about ways that we can kind of engage in the public forum in terms of what a lot of us have done in terms of writing op-eds or kind of offering different kinds of public commentary, but also kind of engaging with each other and doing it in a way that can be as public as possible and can really kind of help have a dialogue amongst ourselves that kind of helps to really shape the broader public conversation. I think is really important. So much appreciated. And just also want to say a lot of appreciation for the really kind of amazing struggle that's been taking place over the past really month and a half now, that is the whole reason why we're here. And I think it's, there's a couple, well, let me just start by saying, there's a couple of things that I want to kind of communicate in terms of kind of key elements of my research that are kind of maybe useful for this conversation. And they kind of build on some of the points that have already been made. My work, particularly the work that I'm doing now for War for the City, is really born out of an effort to try to kind of tie together a history of mass incarceration and really try to offer a way of understanding it that's less top-down and more bottom-up than many of the kind of narratives that we've been given. And so to some degree echoing Simon, really focused on mass incarceration and the sort of elements of the criminal justice system is really local phenomenon rather than sort of like federally instituted ones. And that not simply for a question of kind of properly understanding how things work, but also to have a sense of how can we work at creating change. And we've sort of seen that in this moment where, you know, the city council in Milwaukee has been really pushed to start to take changes, and particularly, I'm sorry to correct myself, Minneapolis has really started to make changes in terms of reforming and potentially abolishing its police department, and how that has taken place in ways where other cities lag behind in terms of taking up some of those efforts, and the degree to which that's indicative of really the work, the really important work that takes place at a local level, and how that can have nationwide ripple effects is, I think, really key. The other element of my work that I just want to highlight too is I'm very much interested in the interplay between social movements and different elements of the carceral state, what we call the carceral state, different institutions of criminal justice, whether those are policing, the courts, prisons, the way in which the sort of back and forth between movement struggles and those institutions really helps to frame the emergence of what we today would refer to as mass incarceration. And a lot of that is oriented towards thinking about questions of court sentencing, as well as questions of prison administration. But for the purposes of this conversation, one of the things that I've been sort of most focused on is how not simply elements of policing, but particularly police intelligence work, beginning with the creation of one of the nation's first Red Squads or subversive units in Chicago, coming out of the Haymarket riots in 1886, and really efforts by police officials to crack down on anarchists, labor movement organizers, socialists, really shapes the kind of emerging trajectory of how police are looking at repressing social movements, particularly radical social movements. And how these efforts are not simply significant in terms of shaping the contours of those movements, how they develop kind of further along the line, but also typify the kind of lack of democratic control and accountability that we're now really talking about in terms of police departments as a whole. And I would just say Simon highlights this really well in his book when he talks about the work of the Red Squad in Chicago, dealing with the labor movements and Communist Party organizing during the Great Depression. And this is sort of, in some ways, kind of the sort of tip of the spear in terms of how practices that we're talking about today, mechanisms that we talk about today in terms of qualified immunity or police union contracts, the way in which we have these particular mechanisms that really shield police from broader public accountability and lack of democratic control, how efforts to repress social movement organizing really help innovate some of the ways in which the kind of more general problems that we're talking about in terms of policing kind of come to the fore. And one of the kind of last examples that I want to highlight is in terms of, like, say, questions of militarized policing. One example that oftentimes is referred to is not necessarily in Chicago, but in Los Angeles, the way one of the first SWAT teams in the country is organized to deal with the Los Angeles branch of the Black Panther Party, and really is organized to carry out a raid on the LA Panther headquarters. And similar efforts in terms of challenging the actions of radical social movement takes place in Chicago in the 1960s, but more so oriented on trying to crack down on efforts to politicize gang members and gang organizing that's more community oriented rather than simply focused on sort of petty criminal activity. And that, and we'll have some opportunity to talk about that a bit more later on. In a lot of my work, really, that's sort of not just simply focusing on sort of subversive activity, but developing intelligence mechanisms at the local level, not at the FBI level, but in the local police departments to gather information on, infiltrate, and really ensure the conviction and incarceration of those involved in gang organizations really sets the tone for the 1970s and the 1980s in terms of the growth of the prison system in Illinois, and also shaping the kind of contours of prison struggles that take place in that state as well. And so one of the things that I really want folks to kind of keep in mind is this back and forth dynamic that we're going to continue to see playing out in our moment as well, in terms of how efforts to police and crack down on not simply everyday criminal activity, but particularly kind of social movement politics and particularly some of the more radical elements of these movements provides really opportunities to innovate and kind of further create problems in terms of how these elements of the state operate. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Toussaint. That was great. All right, so last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Ashley Howard, Assistant Professor of History, also at the University of Iowa. Dr. Howard is currently preparing a book manuscript titled Prairie Fires, Class, Gender, and regional intersections in the 1960s urban rebellions that analyzes the 1960s urban rebellions in the Midwest and is grounded in the way race, class, gender, and region played critical and overlapping roles in defining resistance to racialized oppression. Dr. Howard's work has appeared in Real News Network, The Black Scholar, No Jargon Podcast, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. So take it away, Ashley. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I'll keep my remarks brief because I'm just as excited as to participate in this conversation with these brilliant people ahead of me. So, you know, big up to Charlotte and to Matthew for putting this together, as well as the Urban History Association. And much love and good energy to the people who are out there dreaming and fighting and organizing for justice. As Toussaint said, you make our work possible. So please keep on doing what you're doing. So when asked to think about how does my research inform the present moment, the answer quickly is it does in so many ways, and it completely doesn't, because we're really witnessing something new here. So I'm gonna first hit on some of the ways that we can see parallels and begin to think through some of the similarities, and then briefly discuss how this is so different. And obviously that discussion of why it's different is largely tied because it's still unfolding. So as my beautiful and brilliant colleagues have already established, structural, institutional, gendered, class violence always precedes instances of this kind of property violence that people become so fixated on. And this is one of the great tragedies of American history, right? We only care about violence when buildings burn or when windows are broken, but we don't care about the fact that Freddie Gray had high levels of lead in his body, right? That is a kind of violence that comes from environmental racism, in addition to the violence he suffered by having his back broken in his arrest. So that's the first point. The second point is these uprisings, these street protests that we're witnessing, these are political events. Participants understand them as such, and the state responds as such. And this is key, right? In the 1960s, we see the state taking the grievances, taking the demands that these protesters are making and trying to implement them and listening, and people are referring to themselves as a negotiating team. But because they're political, they can also be co-opted. So just two brief examples. In Milwaukee, we see Mayor Meyer, Henry Meyer, roll out Milwaukee's Marshall Plan, which is a 39-point agenda to really push forward his pet projects, right? It was citywide. It didn't care about the Black community. So he's mobilizing, he's co-opting the uprising for his own thing. And it's not just the people in power, right? H. Rap Brown, who now goes by Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, he swooped in to Cincinnati and put forth his own demands. So in the first kind of two iterations of grievances put forth to the city of Cincinnati, they're looking for Black truck drivers to make deliveries in Black neighborhoods. They're looking for loans so Black business owners can buy out white business owners in the community. And Brown comes and sweeps in, and he says that any proposal put forward needs to be Black people should be able to veto anything that they don't like or any white representative that they don't like, right? That's somebody taking this moment at the national level and taking it for their own agenda. So that's the second thing. Third, people are participating in these activities, in these events, these uprisings, at the intersection of their identities. Your gender identity, your class identity, your racial identity will all dictate how a person will participate. And it's also key, particularly when we think about the 2020 uprisings, to not think of participation as only activities that the state deems criminal, right? You can participate in an uprising and not be doing something to get arrested. Are you patching up people, right? In Cincinnati in the 60s, we saw kind of this underground nursing co-op of people taking care of people injured in the uprising so they wouldn't have to go to the hospital and get arrested. Are you providing water? Are you helping to watch somebody's child so they can go to the protest, right? That is a vote of what the political meaning is, even if you are not out in the street. Fourth, and this is the last kind of point where we can draw some similarities. We have seen time and time again, as my esteemed panelists have said, Radical, not liberal solutions are the medicine to prevent the fire next time, right? We see constantly these well-meaning fixes, right? That only treat the symptom of the problem, don't actually cure the disease. And, you know, the 1960s are rife with these. Two that I think are so haunting for me is in the case of Omaha, Nebraska. We see two police officers who engaged in this cops and kids camping excursion, right? And sensitivity training to help police officers see teenage Black kids as human, right? You need a damn camp to make that happen. It's sad. And in this case, one of them shot and killed a 17-year-old trying to break into a pawn store during an uprising in 1968. And the other, John Loder, shot and killed Vivian Strong, a 14-year-old running away from a party by shooting her in the back of the head, right? Liberal fixes do not work. And these are but for two historical pieces of evidence that demonstrate that. So where do we see this as different? As my colleague Simon has alluded to, you know, we're texting about this a lot. I have some gestures that I'm thinking about, but it's exciting, it's unfolding. We don't know where we're going here, but I am so hopeful in witnessing this. So first of all, the 2020 uprisings are global and simultaneous, right? On a scale that is unprecedented. Again, to put these kind of numbers in perspective, in 1967, the so-called year of the rebellion, 164 uprisings took place. Now, again, that's a fluid number. This is what the Kerner Commission said. Currently, we have 2,000 types of street protests happening in the United States, in every single state and in 60 countries worldwide, right? This is huge. The stat that kind of gave me the chills when I kind of put these two things together is this following. Between 1965 and 1968, 60,000 people were arrested in connection with uprising activity. The day of George Floyd's funeral, 60,000 people marched in the streets in Houston, right? That is a beautiful, beautiful testimony that I think the tide is changing. People understand what scholars, people understand what Black people, Indigenous people, trans people have been saying for a century, right? That they are targeted disproportionately and our lives are at jeopardy because of this. The final thing that I think is important that we saw arising out of the Arab Spring, that we saw with Black Lives Matter, is how important social media is. It's important as a tactical tool, it's important as a witnessing tool, and it's important as a framing tool. And this is helping people draw connections, helping them to organize, and helping to put this in conversation at a global context, to move and to think just beyond George Floyd's murder to the ways that we need to think about the structural and institutional violence that, you know, mucks up our life on the regular, to speak it, you know, very plainly. So with that, I will end my comments and look forward to this discussion as well.
Thank you. Well, that was incredible. I'm gonna get back.
Matt, I think you're still muted a little bit.
Am I? Can you hear me? Hello. Okay. I'm gonna get back to, I promise, the kind of futility of liberal reform of police, because I think that is something particularly that historians of police can speak to. But I want to first talk about another thread that's woven through this, which is the politics of neglect, and how we are in this current moment, especially grappling with how the state can so commit to over-policing and brutalizing and harassing at the one moment, and also neglecting its duty to protect and safeguard in the exact same moment. And I think that ties us to the other major event that we're all living through right now, which is the current pandemic, which is exacerbating the chasm between both race and economics in this country, and is also, I think, showing the kind of deep disparities in public health, and also the disparities between the state's duty to neglect in some places and to brutalize in others. So I wanted to open up by talking about, like, in our current moment, are we rethinking the role of the state in our daily lives in relation to both its public health obligations and also it's the kind of knife's edge of the state of policing? So I guess if you all could raise your hands either like physically or on Zoom, we can. Yeah, Simon, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I'll be very brief. I mean, your question prompts me to actually think back on the We Charge Genocide petition to the UN in 1951. Where, I mean, it was, I don't recall the exact quote, but the quote is essentially that for a lot of Black communities by that point in time, the police had become the state, right? They become the agents of the state. And so, when I think about this, I mean, I think about the arguments that abolitionists like Mariame Kaba and many others have made about how, people sort of live in different worlds. Like, I mean, so I think that in some ways it's difficult for people to understand abolitionist arguments because their engagements with the state are fundamentally different, right? I mean, so it doesn't compute for someone who's white and lives in a wealthy or middle class neighborhood to think about the fact that for a lot of people who are, Black, brown, indigenous, poor, who, the fact that they predominantly experience the state as an agent of repression, like it doesn't compute for I think a lot of those folks. And so I think that when we think about the history of this and the evolution of the state as really being the primary, if not the primary, perhaps the primary agent of repression over time, in American cities, and trace that through how people experience policing. I think that people who are skeptical of abolition have to understand that the way that they experience the state is fundamentally different than how a lot of other people experience the state. And that, I mean, I don't know if like those of us who are on the Zoom call are like, this moment is causing us to rethink how we think of the state presence, but I would hope that people would be listening very seriously who aren't on the Zoom call to those who don't actually understand what the state looks like and who don't understand what structural violence looks like and who don't understand what health disparities look like. And the fact that, for literally 70 years now, or 69 years, when the Civil Rights Congress issues that the We Charge Genocide petition, 69 years ago, people were saying that the ways that the state presents itself in Black communities is the police. And so when we think about how that sort of lineage has just, it's manifested over time. And so thinking about how the absolute neglect and denial of meaningful investment has just been dumped and dumped and dumped into that particular part of the state, I think is something that people really have to reckon with anytime they want to express skepticism about the project of defunding and abolition.
Ashley, go ahead.
That was a hand of co-signing.
I mean, and I was really thinking about what you were saying earlier about how part of state violence is neglect and how a lot of the violence it neglects is gendered. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yes, and I had just found the raise hand button, so thank you then for calling me out. Right, so I think there's two ways we can look at this, right? I'll start with sort of the what the police historian in me is reckoning with, and then I'll do what I think feminist activism and thought can teach us. So first, right, there's this, it goes back to Joe Trotter, Black Milwaukee. There's this concept that I know Simon used in his book as well, right? That Black residents confront both over policing, right, and under protection, right? So they are sort of bombarded by police force, but when they need help, right, when somebody needs help, the police are nowhere to be found, right? And I think we're starting to reckon with that concept because that presumes, right, when we think about under protection, it presumes that police can actually deliver, that police actually have the capacity, right, to deliver protective services. So we really need to stop and think about that. And, especially for folks who right now are listening in and feel like they do have the benefit of those protective services from police. I hope that this call and your educational work, your self-educational work, being in conversation with others, I hope that when you think about how you benefit from that protection, you also think about the deep structure of violence, right, that undergirds it, the deep structure of violence, murder, brutality, right, that funds that protection for mostly elite white folks, right, mostly elite white, I think about cities, so folks in the city. So that's something that I think we really need to think about, that concept of under protecting and over policing. And what feminists teach us, right, is that the state does as much violence in what it does as in what it does not do, right? To Dr. Howard's point, right, Freddie Gray was murdered by police and yet also had toxic levels of lead in his body, right? So there are all these ways in which neglect itself builds up as in materially violent ways. For feminists, of course, this is a question of, for example, right, women who are struggling to support their families and might have to turn to actions or presumed behaviors that are criminalized, right, in order to feed their families, right? But where is the money, right? Where is the state funding in order to support women's reproduction, right? Where is the money to support actual social reproductive work? It's not there. In lieu of that state absence, in lieu of that state neglect, we get state violence instead. And I'll finally just close, because I had mentioned it, I had alluded to it in my talk, my opening remarks. We also have sex worker advocates, sex worker activists, and their allies have said since at least the 1970s, right, that the criminalization of poor and marginalized women now, in particular in this historical moment that is particularly trans women of color, there have been recurring epidemics of serial murders. Black women were murdered in the 1970s and 1980s, and we are seeing that same epidemic of violence, that reign of terror now, particularly targeting Black trans women, right? And what activists said in the 70s and 80s was that, and this is a direct quote, and so I apologize for the language, but they said, police hunt down hookers, which sends a green light to other men that they can hunt down hookers too. Right now, the thing is, my research shows, right, police are not actually hunting down hookers. They are just targeting sexually profiled women, women who have maybe, who are just being targeted for how they look, where they are, who they're talking to, right? So police hunt down sexually profiled women, women who have been targeted and identified as criminalizable, right, as arrestable, and that makes them vulnerable to non-state violence as well, non-state male violence. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I'll get to the question I've been also hoping to ask, which is, studying the history of policing lends itself toward an abolitionist viewpoint because we as historians see the constant stream of attempts at reforming. I mean, there's hardly a moment in the history of policing where there isn't some commissioner or mayor or politician or federal commission that isn't actively trying to reform police by instituting the kind of same tool belt of liberal reforms. And I was wondering if all of you have seen moments in your research of reforms that have taken root and failed, reforms that have been in place and then have incidentally done more harm to communities, or also reform that just doesn't have the political capital to even get off the ground because police as a political bloc have prevented it from doing so. I was wondering if I could open that up to the panel. So who wants to take a crack at that first? It's a big question.
Yeah, I'll maybe push the door open a little bit, and then hopefully my colleagues can keep it going. I wanted to just real quickly pick up a little bit on a little bit of the last question, because I thought it was, I thought the point that Anne was making was really important, particularly this quote about Black communities, and this came out of Chicago, being over-policed and underprotected. And I just want to raise up the fact that that was a kind of a way of analyzing what was taking place in terms of policing during the 1960s by a group called the Afro-American Patrolmen's League, which was a group of Black officers who were radicalized by the rebellions of the 1960s and were really forced to reorient their ways of doing policing in a more attempt to kind of try to operate in a more community-oriented way, as opposed to simply, operating as a sort of Black officers who went along with whatever the white officers were doing. And that part of what kind of looking at that history kind of tells us about not only the kind of developments that we could see coming in terms of the ways in which challenges, really widespread mobilizations against racism in policing, as well as the institutional racism of policing, creates really chances to kind of force particularly Black officers or even justice-minded police officers to really challenge and expose many of really kind of what's taking place in police departments around the country. That also that kind of goes hand in hand with the kind of story, the is in Simon's book around groups like the Afro-American Patrolmen's League, really goes hand in hand with the kind of way in which, beginning in that kind of mid-1970s period, we see the takeoff in terms of how efforts to reform the police can kind of consistently break down and fail, as well as the expansion of other elements of the criminal justice system, including courts and prisons, makes mass incarceration feasible, and how the kind of organized abandonment that is part and parcel of the economy, the post-1970s economy, really fosters not only the kind of investment that we've seen in policing and other elements of the criminal justice system, but also our inability to have a public health sector, a kind of basic community level medical services that could meet the scale of the pandemic that we're dealing with. And that is, those two things go hand in hand. And I just want to highlight too, Simon's spoken a couple of times to abolition. Folks like Miriam Kaba, other abolitionists, consistently speak to the fact that it's because we have this investment in the sort of repressive arms of the state that we don't have the kind of things that are needed to be able to safeguard ourselves, to provide for the general welfare as it's kind of stated in the Constitution, but we're still sort of struggling with in practice in terms of being able to meet the basic needs for individuals to be able to survive both in this pandemic and then also now this kind of depression economy that we're now dealing with. And one of the things that's striking, and both Simon and I have looked at this history, is that you have this kind of moment, this sort of seminal moment where there's not only, say, 1970 Chicago, and this is kind of echoed in a number of other cities, you have these really significant kind of mass movements for police reform that are not just the sort of elites of a city saying we need to tinker with different elements of policing, but really involve a host of different grassroots organizations, largely led by Black and Brown organizers, to say we need to create police reform. and we need to be mindful of the kind of deep problems within our police system. Analysts, criminal justice analysts, journalists have pointed out that some of the same reforms that were advocated for in 1976, 1977 in Chicago, some of the same problems that were identified and some of the same reforms that were kind of suggested, not just sort of the body cameras, but some of the more kind of nuanced policing mechanisms, accountability mechanisms, training, and so forth, reappear so many years later in 2013, 2014, 2015, when we see similar levels of protests around policing, and again, this is in Chicago, following a host of different police killings that really set off waves of protest. And it's that kind of dynamic and the similar sort of, the almost sort of Groundhog Day question of looking at the way in which part of the problem of police reform operates in such a way as it sort of takes the sort of fundamental assumptions that make policing deeply problematic and really mobilize and really make, in some ways, if we sit down with it, demands for abolition common sense. Much of what we see taking place with these sort of reform efforts is they sort of simply take for granted much of the way in which policing is supposed to operate, and sort of tinker around the edges as opposed to kind of uprooting from the base and seeing what more fundamentally could be changed as a way to replace that institution.
Awesome, thank you. We're gonna have some more people hop in on this question, but I just wanted to pop in and remind folks, in case you came in a little bit late, about how to submit questions for the panelists. So you can do so by emailing the Metropole at urbanhistory.org, or the Metropole editor, Ryan Reft, is currently manning the UHA Twitter, which is at urbanhistorya, and you can send him a DM or just at him in a tweet. So just wanted to remind everyone about that, to submit cues. And I think now we're gonna hop to Ashley, yeah?
I was just being a diligent student and raising my hand, but yes, I'm here. Yeah, and you know, when I really wanted to say, yes, we can look to this project or we can look at this activist, and we tried and we didn't quite get it right, but it's always failed, you know? And if we look at just the commissions, right? If we look at all the reports that have come up from all of the uprisings that have happened over the, you know, the long 20th century. So the 1919 Chicago, the 1935 Harlem, the 43 Detroit, the 65 McCone Commission in Los Angeles, the 67 Carter Commission, all the way up to the 2015 Commission on Ferguson with a Black president and a Black attorney general. The same conclusions are made. It sucks to be Black in America. Economically, we suffer. Medically, we suffer. Legally, we suffer. All of the markers of the American dream, African Americans fall behind on. And they blame the structures, they blame racism, and all of the well-meaning ways that they try to institute it fall short, right? And so I think this is part of the problem here, is that as Americans, we want to believe in this, our myth of innocence, right? That, oh, we didn't know things were so bad. How can we not, right? And this, it's always this surprise that people take to the streets, that people are upset because we, and maybe not we, the folks who are listening today, but many of our fellow people have these blinders on or can explain away why these things are happening, right? And I think this is one of the biggest power that social media has, is it puts Black voice in an uncontestable position, right? And that's such a disgusting thing to really think about, that for, 100 years, Black people have said this, but when you can see live and in living color, somebody kneeling on a man's neck for 9 minutes, including 2 minutes after he was non-responsive, that really solidifies this terror that we have experienced for so long. And it's that mind shift that we needed to have, right? That believing Black truth, finally, is that shift that goes, not this kind of well-meaning implementation to adjust or, alter slightly, but not do a complete 180 on the system.
Can I jump in too?
Simon, please.
So I mean, yes to all of this, and I also, I want to just go back a few years earlier than what you were talking about, too, as well. So, people who are talking about police reform, I think, are operating under an entirely misplaced assumption that police want to reform. So, the story, the most important moment of police reform and police professionalization in the history of the city of Chicago was from 1960 to 1967 under a guy named Orlando Wilson. And so Orlando Wilson was considered one of the most esteemed criminal justice minds in the nation. He was poached from the Dean of Criminology at University of California, Berkeley, to come head up a completely, corrupt, racist, brutal, disorganized Chicago Police Department. And so he's brought in to, quote unquote, fix this department. So the story of what happens in those intervening 7 years is really, it's complex in some ways, but the big through lines that people need to understand is that Wilson wanted to do really kind of two parallel tracks of reform. One, he wanted to make the police more efficient. He wanted to make it more, to increase arrests, increase police citizen contact. He wanted to, he implemented arrest quotas in Black neighborhoods, and, lobbied hard for stop and frisk and so on and so forth. So he did all of those things, that were modernizing the police and making them supposedly more responsive to crime, even though crime actually was skyrocketing by the end of his term as compared to what it was when he first came to Chicago. But so he wanted to do that. And then on the other side, he wanted to make police more accountable for the actions that they did. So for the first time under his administration, he implements an internal investigations division to make sure, supposedly, that police who are really brutal will be held to account. But guess which one of those two things he succeeds at and which one he fails at? It's not that complicated. He succeeds fantastically in increasing the power of the police and increasing the racial repression of the police, even though he himself deemed himself a good racial liberal. But what happened was that when he began to try to make police more accountable, they revolted against him. His own rank and file revolted against him. So, and that's led by police organizations who were not yet being called unions because they didn't have official union status, but they're essentially what we know as police unions. It's led by organizations eventually like the Fraternal Order of Police, which now dominates police labor issues in Chicago. And they essentially try to run him out of town simply for him saying, if you brutalize people, we will try to hold you accountable. And they win that war. So in that moment from 1960 to 1967, we see this massive increase of police power, and we see this absolutely failed effort to hold police accountable for that power. And the reason that it fails is because police explicitly say they refuse to be held accountable. And that's the entire history from basically the 1960s onward of how police and police unions have operated. And I'm a union guy, but we need to understand that if you think police want to be reformed, you're dreaming. And I think people have to really understand that and reckon with it who argue for reform, because it's just, how do you actually bring someone to the table to do reform when they are telling you constantly that they don't want to be reformed?
Yeah, that's a really great point to end on, I think, for that section. So thank you all. So we're gonna bring in some of the questions that were submitted to us. And one actually kind of picks up a little bit on something you alluded to briefly, Ashley, but anyone should feel free to jump in on this question. The question is more of actually a statement, but I can kind of form it into a question. It says, I have been appalled by the response of many Black liberal politicians to the protests and police violence. In Detroit, they give us an example. Brenda Jones, a Black city councilwoman, has towed the police agenda during the uprisings in the city. So maybe kind of as a broad question, can you speak to maybe kind of the history of Black political elites in this history of police reform, both maybe historically and presently, kind of however it makes sense for you. But yeah, who wants to jump in first? Anyone want to take that one? Okay.
Well,
yeah.
Just briefly, like this, I think this is a big part of the story, right? Is these intra-racial class struggles, right? So often Black folk want to be read as just homogenous. They have all the same issues, and certainly race oppression looms largely over our lives. But how you feel that, right? Malcolm X had this analogy of being in a hot pot while they're turning up the heat versus being plunged into boiling water. And so in the 1960s, we very much see kind of the upper class, the elite saying, oh no, this is not how we do this, you know, that's a rogue element. We have to go through the established channels. But what they didn't realize is that those established channels, working class people had been trying to agitate through and try to have their needs met, but they're being ignored. Right. And, you know, there's a great quote that says, a leader in a city was saying that, you know, I wasn't even invited to the parade. I'm no longer the marshal. And they're like, you weren't invited to this parade. This ain't your show anymore. And I think that is what we're seeing, the tension, right? We saw this come out a bit with Black Lives Matter when they first came onto the scene, right? That, well, we need leadership. You know, Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader. Who's BLM's leader? And they said, we're leaderful. We all can contribute. We all have something. And so this is most certainly a generational divide as well as a class position divide.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that in some instances, it shouldn't be, it's shocking, but it shouldn't be too surprising. For years now, and this is more presentist than it is historical, we've seen analysts at publications like Black Agenda Report highlight this question of a Black misleadership class and the fact that Black elected officials have not only established a particular kind of entrenched power within the Democratic Party, but also not offered much in terms of leadership and rather have been more focused on maintaining the status quo. That, I think, picks up on exactly what Ashley was saying in terms of this question of this kind of intra-class dynamic, particularly if we think about the kind of class position that most, if not all, Black elected officials are at, and really the kind of working class poor circumstances that most folks who are on the receiving end of police violence find themselves at. The one other thing I would add, and this really was highlighted in some of the research that I did during the Harold Washington administration in Chicago. And Harold Washington is somebody who's a much beloved elected official. And unfortunately, part of what we see play out is his tenure in office dovetails with this really horrendous scandal that's only recently been revealed of police torture that took place by a individual who was a police lieutenant, rose to the level of commander, but took place over a series of several decades, a decade and a half, really. And one of the things that not only that torture scandal that took place during Harold Washington's administration, but also Harold Washington's own kind of admittance was really kind of typifies some of what Simon just spoke about, which is not only are police resistant to accountability, but because of the way in which so many reform efforts have tinkered around the edges, there aren't really much in the way of, there's very little in the way of accountability measures that exist, and only recently kind of ways of gaining information about what takes place in terms of policing. So part of what Harold Washington spoke to at various different points was, as much as he wanted to incentivize the police department in Chicago to be less brutal, and to also be more effective at responding to the needs of his Black constituents in terms of dealing with questions of crime, he found himself not having a whole lot of control over the police department. And I think Harold Washington is someone who, I think that kind of admission should be respected, in that not very few Black elected officials are willing to say, this is a problem that I don't have much control over. And this is an entity that, because of Supreme Court decisions, because of local laws and policy and decision-making, most, if not all, police departments operate in a way that is relatively autonomous from the way in which most of the city is governed, and are able to exert a certain amount of political pressure and lobbying pressure to see that they not only can push back on reform efforts, but can demand every year incremental increases in their budgeting, and not just that, but the city to pay for, and in some instances take out bonds on Wall Street to cover the cost of the brutality that they inflict on citizens. And so we're not yet, and I don't know if we will get to a kind of come to Jesus moment with those kind of elected officials who are saying, you know what, this is something that I'm not able to completely control, and it's going to create a broader conversation and a more radical solution to actually figure out to come to some sort of new terms in terms of what is taking place.
Thanks. Anne, did you want to hop in as well? I think I saw your hand up. Yeah.
I was just actually messaging you. I'm totally mindful of time. I know we went over, so I could add something briefly, but I also fully understand if you want to wrap it up.
I think you should hop in. We will wrap up soon enough, don't worry. But yeah, I think you should hop in for sure.
Thank you. Right, I also wanted to add just some thoughts on Black political leadership based on my own research in Atlanta. And this is definitely something that's been weighing on my mind, because Brene Hall, the Black police chief of the DPD, recently, just today, said, oh, my big reform, right, is going to be that after 72 hours, we will release footage of use of force and murder. So I thought that is just a really striking, if anyone needs a striking example of liberal reform and how it does not, and what good it is and what good it does, I think it's a very good example. So Atlanta was a major moment in 1973 when Maynard Jackson was elected, right? Here's this finally a moment, right, of Black representation in a majority Black city in the South, right? This was extremely exciting. And I came to that research asking, exactly, how did broken windows policing, right? How did the mass misdemeanor policing, right? So major police forces enforcing public order, right? Or just mass drives on the street for very low level misdemeanor offenses, loitering, right? Street vending, right? All sorts of really things that have been invented as crime, right? Not criminal acts that you can just be standing on the street and broken windows policing will tell you that you are illegal, right? So I was curious, how did that get initiated? How did that get instantiated in the very moment, right, when Maynard Jackson and then Andrew Young after him, right, were leading, right, when there was this Black political leadership in Atlanta. And one really inescapable fact was that Black elites might have had the political leadership, they might have had the political representation, but they did not control the Capitol. And that was a huge problem, particularly for Maynard Jackson. He sort of came in and immediately started, he, to his credit, right, starts in sort of antagonizing the major downtown business interests. And there's a very, very contentious relationship, particularly when he tries to fire the notoriously racist police chief and restructure the police department. He does whatever he can. There's a newly reconstituted public safety department, right, that he's trying to wrest that control, right, back to the city, right, trying to bring the APD to heel. So even as he's trying to do that, though, and of course the courts are fighting him and he loses major battles against racist white police leaders. But one of the major problems is that, Capital, the Central Atlanta Progress Inc., the major business consortium, they're basically threatening capital flight. They're basically threatening to, to go on strike, right? And basically hobble the city's economic core. And at the same time, right, they're running massive campaigns smearing Jackson for his, smearing him for, how he allows certain kinds of criminality, like certain super racialized Black criminality to flourish on city streets, which makes it uncomfortable, right, for white people to go and do their business. Right, so they're also running this major smear campaign that targets Jackson and exploits racist tropes about Black men in particular, as a way to bring him around to policing, right? Because he not only was trying to clean up the department, but he was also, not seeing street crime because it was so discretionary, so overly racialized. He was actually trying to say that that's not really a priority when he first came in, right? And the camp was not having it, right? And so they use a lot of, crime politics that would sort of stoke white fear, using that as a stick, right, to get Jackson to come around. And one thing I'll close with, right, is that when Jackson was elected, so there are two major, between 1973 and then 1986, there's two major public-private city reports, right, that Camp sort of spearheads. In 1973, the solution to the problem of the city is in infrastructure, public transportation, right, sort of infrastructure building. Police crime, not really an issue. But by 1986, on the tail end of 2 or 3 Black mayoral administrations, sorry, 2, but they had multiple terms. On the tail end of these 2 Black administrations, police were at the center of these city reports. Police were at the center, the answer to the problem, right? And so much of that had to do with the fact that white capital was using crime as a way to tame, right, Black political leadership. So I think that's also, the Democratic Party also absolutely needs to be interrogated and reckoned with. But there's also the fact that urban politics mean reckoning with white capital, and white capital means doing everything in their power to limit Black political power.
Thank you so much. All right, we're gonna wrap up with one final question because we're very aware that it's getting late and people have gotta get back to their lives. And this comes from a viewer, but it picks up on something that Dr. Howard, you were saying earlier, which is that this is very much becoming rapidly a global movement, not just on behalf of Black lives in America, but also on behalf of kind of racialized police violence and racialized state violence around the globe. And the question is, about whether or not you see the importance of social media as an important kind of globalizing tool of political mobilization and organizing, or whether or not this kind of current moment and the mass politics that we're seeing right now are a result of other things besides just kind of social media and the internet and communication.
I'll answer just briefly so other folks can weigh in. I think social media is huge, both abroad and domestically. Domestically, because it helps people in former sundown, maybe current sundown towns, organize together, find like-minded people, and use social media to get people out. And so these conversations that were in barbershops, that were in beauty salons, that were on porches, are now happening in social media. So that's what's happening domestically. And abroad, what we see is people coming out in solidarity with George Floyd, but they're staying out because of things that go down in their own communities, right? And so in every community, not only are they chanting George Floyd's name, they're also chanting the names of local people, most often immigrants who are people of color, who have also been murdered at the hands of police. So it's that interconnectivity that is happening in real time through social media.
Simon, did you want to hop in here?
I mean, I have less to say specifically about that question, but I would just say that, you know, part of what's happening on social media is the dispersion of Black knowledge of what's of the reality of America, right? And so, I mean, and that's what's really striking to me as a historian is that, you know, we're on social media. You have a lot of white allies and non-Black allies who appear to be outwardly at least appearing to be listening to Black experiences and Black knowledge in a way that I don't think we've seen a lot in the past. And so, I mean, but I think about how history can help us I think about how history shapes this in the sense that, you know, when I referred earlier to the 1951, you know, We Charge Genocide petition, you know, I mean, that's a form of Black knowledge about, you know, about police violence and police repression that's just completely discarded. And, you know, and it's not just that. I mean, you know, in the 1940s, you know, Black radicals in the Chicago press are talking about the police using the idiom of terrorism. And so when we think about how, like, this moment compares to the last, I think that actually, you know, although earlier I made a sort of a through line argument, I think that part of what is different now is an embrace or an acknowledgement of Black knowledge in a way that has not happened in the past. And it's been to the detriment, not just to Black communities, but I think to everyone who believes and wishes for a better country, that, you know, that because of racist logics about Black thought, of Black knowledge, has been discarded in the past. And so, so I think that is an important shift right now. And I hope that continues, because in the past, you know, white allyship and non-Black allyship has been suspect in these, you know, moments. And so, I mean, that's what I would say. And I think that social media has become an important, you know, distributor of Black knowledge.
Oh, I think Toussaint, you're still muted, maybe.
Yeah, just to add on to that real quick, because I think both of those points are really germane. That part of what is really special about this moment, and Robin D.G. Kelly has kind of highlighted this in a couple of like recent interviews that he's done, is that the sort of upsurge that we've seen happen, as much as it sort of seems spontaneous, has also built very concretely on the really, sustained and determined social movement work that's happened kind of in and around the Black Lives Matter movement, but a host of different organizations, even a group that kind of builds off of the name of that Civil Rights Congress report, We Charge Genocide, groups that have really highlighted not just the question of state violence in the United States, but built a kind of global effort to address it, and really made outreaches to organizations or solidarity efforts around the world. The Black Lives Matter Global Network was even the sort of framework for some of this sort of earlier 2015, 2016 round of protests. And that, I think, is emblematic of a kind of long sort of strategy or approach in Black freedom struggles, is to sort of use the international arena as a framework. So as much as social media has made the distribution of that knowledge really key, it's also been laid on top of a foundation that is both recent and also has a long history. If you go back to even, say, the Scottsboro Boys campaign of the 1930s, the way in which that was internationalized as a campaign as a way to deal with the domestic issue, but using the international arena as a way to think about, this is how we can get justice in this town in Alabama. And that is a framework that's been a relatively important one for a long period of time.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you all people who tuned in. I know we went on a lot longer than we had anticipated, but it was a very, very good conversation. I just want to remind people that, you know, Charlotte and I edit Disciplining the City, which is the series at the Metropole, the blog of the Urban History Association, where you can find a lot of great content by scholars on the history of Black organizing and police violence in the United States and around the world also, in cities around the globe. So please check out the metropole.blog, check out Urban History A on Twitter, and please tune in next week, Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. We will be doing this all over again with a whole new panel of carceral studies scholars. We're going to be talking about urban uprisings and urban inequality and police violence. So thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.